first setting that you need to change in Rainbow Six Siege is your crosshair color. As you can see right now, it defaults to red or green if you're on some guns. Now, as much as red and green aren't some of the worst colors you could have as your crosshair color, there are just better options. The reason that red might be a bad option is because there are some very bright red walls, like this wall in Hall of Fame. It is very hard to see exactly where the center dot of your crosshair is if you have a red crosshair. It's also a bit too dark, so if you're spawn peeking in a dark map, or at least darker than normal, or you're trying to shoot somebody in a dark room, the red crosshair is really just hard to shoot people with sometimes. Not only are dark crosshairs hard to use, but if you're spawn peeking or shooting in a bright setting, bright crosshairs can also be harder to use. If I'm trying to contest a Cali that's out here on the breach and I'm moving a lot, it's going to be pretty hard for me to see exactly where my crosshair is lining up to shoot the Cali if I have a white crosshair and I'm spawn peeking the outside of a map that is predominantly pretty bright. So if red or any dark crosshair, or white and any bright crosshairs aren't the best crosshairs to use, then what are the best colors? Well, in my opinion, the best crosshair color in the entire game is purple. It's bright enough to where you can still see in pretty much any hallway, and there's no real purple rooms around most of the maps, meaning that it doesn't really blend in with anywhere, and you can see your crosshair no matter where you go. So there's not a single environment where having this crosshair color can really impact you in any negative way. If purple's really not your style and you want a second recommendation, I definitely recommend turquoise or green as an option. There's some maps like Emerald Plains where there's a lot of green hallways where green can be an issue, so turquoise naturally is just the better option. When I'm spawn peeking outside, it's not too bright, and I can pretty much see where my crosshair is at all times, and in dark rooms it really shines a lot. Now that was just one out of 13 different settings that you need to change in Rainbow Six Siege. The second of which being your anti-aliasing setting. Now, if you're running the game on Ultra, the default will be TAA 4X, but if you're running on a lower end PC and you haven't really changed your graphic settings, the default should be on TAA. Both of these options are pretty bad, as are the other two, except for the option of just off. Turning off anti-aliasing in this game will save you FPS because your PC isn't worried about having screen tears, so it's working less hard in order to get you more frames. If you really care about render scaling, and maybe screen tears just aren't something you want to deal with, then the only other option that I really recommend is just regular TAA. Here, you can mess with your render scaling and your sharpness, but anything beyond that, I honestly wouldn't recommend touching in terms of anti-aliasing. Off is just always going to be the better option. Now, if you go to the HUD tab in your settings, another setting that you need to turn off is your teammate outlines. Now, you might be thinking that this is a personal preference setting, and to be completely honest, to a certain extent, it is. But after experimenting with this setting myself for a long time, I definitely can say, in terms of my gameplay, that turning it off has helped me a lot. There have been many scenarios where there has been an enemy in between me and a teammate, and because the teammate's outline is on, I cannot clearly see the enemy that is in front of me because the outline on my HUD is covering that enemy, and I don't want to actually wallbang my teammate because I know he's there, making me hesitate when I take the gunfight. This is something that you don't want to have to deal with. And if you have any semblance of depth perception at all, having just your teammates' icons above their head, and not even really their names, can give you the information that you need that outlines provide without actually getting in the way of having free kills if your teammate is behind someone you're trying to kill. Another setting that you can turn off that seemingly can get you free kills is turning off auto for your aspect ratio. Now, for most people, the automatic aspect ratio that your computer is set to is 16:9. So if you're on 16:9 as well, you're not safe. By the way, this tip only works for PC players, as console players can't change their aspect ratio yet. So if you're a console player, skip to the timestamp that's on screen. Now, 16:9 is your native aspect ratio. The only issue is that it is a bit too compressed horizontally to be good and comfortable for most Rainbow Six Siege players. For example, if I want to hold an angle into Z-Hall right here, and I'm sitting main lobby, the player who actually swings me Z-Hall, if he is on a more stretched resolution, will be able to see my shoulder a lot quicker than I'll be able to see his, due to the fact that I am on a more compressed aspect ratio. So, because most players like to be able to get an advantage, but they don't want their aspect ratio to look super stretched, they put their aspect ratio on 16:10. This is not really a huge difference. But for most players who have trouble looking through pixel peaks, this just gives you an extra bit of room on your screen to be able to see people if you're holding tighter angles, and it makes you play a little bit differently because reinforcements are wider, which makes you feel like you have more safe cover. There's also something to be said about the types of weapons that you run determining your aspect ratio. For example, if you love running ACOGs, especially the ACOG B, I don't recommend actually having a super stretched aspect ratio like 5:4, 4:3, or 3:2. As you can see, the more of your screen gets taken up by the peripherals of your scope, meaning that if somebody were to be like on, let's say, the bottom of White Stairs, and I were to be ADS'd at the shower hall here, I couldn't see them walk up because my scope looks so fucking large on my screen. So if you like to use ACOGs, don't run something stretched like 5.4, 4.3, or 3.2. But if you're running 1x scopes, this is actually advantageous for you because the 1x scopes looks stretched, making 1x scopes look almost similar to ACOGs if they were on 1610. So if you're somebody that likes to play smoke, or that just likes having no recoil on Twitch's F2, I definitely recommend a more stretched resolution for you. If you don't like the look of having your game so stretched though, then I definitely recommend that everybody watching this video sets their aspect ratio to 1610. Now, as much as that tip might have been personal preference, this next setting that you need to turn off is completely mandatory. And that is your drone deployment being on standard. You want to turn this on to advanced. The difference between standard and advanced is whether or not you get on your drone after throwing it or not. So if my drone deployment was on standard, when I throw my drone, I would automatically get on my drone to then drone in. This might seem like it's important because it saves you an extra half a second and it immediately gets you to where you want to be. However, defenders who are right next to you that you may not know are there will use this to their advantage. If they hear you throwing a drone and they know that you're going to get on it, they're going to swing out and kill you before you have time to react. However, if you turn your drone deployment off of standard and you put it on advanced, this no longer becomes an issue because when you throw your drone out, you don't automatically get on your drone. Meaning that if you're ever droning a doorway like this with no information, you can throw your drone out and then just sit and ADS the doorway. If that person swings, you can be ready and shoot them, but if no one does swing, then you can get on your drone because you know it's safe and drone out the building. Yes, this does take up an extra 2 seconds of your time, but most of the time, that's not even going to be that impactful for you, and it can a lot of times get you a free kill or at least save your life in the process. Another thing that can save your life is having higher FPS, which is why the next setting that you need to turn off is having no FPS limit. Having your FPS limit set to off theoretically would make it to where you don't have a limit on how much FPS you could get. It's purely based off of computing power, meaning you get the most FPS possible, right? Well, that's not actually necessarily true. You see, for example, I have a 144 Hz monitor. It's nothing too crazy, but it's not really that bad either. It's a pretty nice monitor. But you can think of the refresh rate on a monitor being 1-to-1 with the amount of FPS that you'll be getting in the game. If, for example, your FPS was limited to 75, sure, you may have a 144 Hz monitor, but because the game is limiting you to 75 FPS, you will only be getting 75 frames, and for that matter, and for sake of the argument, 75 Hz. So in theory, turning this completely off would make it to where you never have a limit on your FPS, but because the limit of Hertz on my refresh rate monitor is 144, even if I were to get like 300 FPS like I have right now in the bottom left corner, my screen would still only display 144 Hz. So uncapping your FPS is only going to make your computer strain more, meaning that you want to set your FPS limit to exactly what your refresh rate is. For example, my refresh rate is 144, so I'm going to set my FPS limit to 144. As you can see right now on this graph, it is capped at 144, and because I have a good PC, it's going to stay there reliably the entire time, so I don't have to worry about random frame drops, and I don't have to worry about my PC working twice as hard for no reason. Another very important setting that you need to turn off is 60 FOV. You want to have your FOV on at least 83 all the way up to 90. 90 is pretty high for most people, and I like to keep mine at around 87, but having a higher FOV means you can have a bigger peripheral vision. For example, if I were to stare, let's say, at this vase or maybe through this wall on 60 FOV, I wouldn't be able to see the staircase. So if anyone was walking up the staircase, they'd be able to kill me, and I wouldn't know any better. But with a higher FOV, that no longer becomes an issue. Although I will say, the lower FOV you have, the more scope room you're going to have because it's going to be less compressed. So you want to find a good middle ground, which is why I don't really run 90 FOV and I just tend to stick to 87. Another display setting that you need to turn off if you want a better viewing experience is the default HUD display area, which is 100. Now this is what a default HUD looks like. As you can see, my HUD is a lot bigger than it has been for the past bit of this video. The match header at the top is bigger, my loadout and things on the bottom right are bigger, my health bar and my metrics on the bottom left are also bigger. So is my compass and the actions that are reminding me to drop or pick up this diffuser. Everything is just bigger. Why would you want that? Well, the answer is, you wouldn't. I'll bring you back to the white stairs example. If I'm trying to clear out this hallway, whether it be holding the shower hallway, or just trying to clear out security, my 100 health bar in the bottom left right there and my metrics could actually cover white stairs and cover people coming up the staircase. It's something that would only happen to you one in every maybe 600 ranked games, but it's something that has happened to me in the past, and it is why I go to my options, I go to my display, and I turn my HUD all the way down to minimal. This does make my HUD look smaller, which is great. Now you might be thinking that it puts it more in the center of my screen, and that's true. But it being in the center of my screen has actually made me die a lot less than it being on the edge of my screen, and it being smaller has made my viewing experience a lot less cluttered and more enjoyable. So it is personal preference. but I can't deny that it does give you an advantage if you make this as small as possible. Something that actually puts you at a disadvantage though is having your shadow quality on low. Having your shadow quality on low actually makes it to where you can barely see shadows. For example, I put a deployable shield outside, and it is emitting kind of a shadow, but if you were up in, let's say, rafters, which is where you would be in this example, that honestly just looks like the shadow of the door frame. So you're not going to notice if that shadow was a player shadow that the player would be on the left side of the doorway. However, if you were to put that shadow at medium or higher, that shadow is much more clear and defined, so you now know that it is absolutely a player. If I put it on very high, it's even more clearly outlined and more noticeable, and it doesn't really do much to your console or PC in terms of making it have to run any harder. It's a pretty small change, but if I'm sitting in rafters, and instead of that being a shadow of a deployable shield, it was a shadow of an actual player, I would know that that player's on the left side of the doorway way before he ever swings, which makes it to where I can put my crosshair in the correct position and pre-fire him and get a free kill. This specific example on the garage door, I have gotten so many free kills with just because of that shadow, which is why I actually recommend that you never swing from that side of the door if you're an attacker, just swing from that side, but that's really besides the point. You need to have your shadows on at least medium or higher in order to get the most out of this mechanic. Another settings mistake that you absolutely need to turn off is having a low LOD quality in your graphics tab in your settings. If I take you to the map of Skyscraper, and we're looking at these huge wooden beams that are running across the geisha wall here, if I back up far enough, those lines completely disappear, which is absolutely bad, because those lines are about as thick as a punch hole would be, meaning that if you're this far away, you wouldn't be able to see a punch hole if somebody was trying to shoot you, unless of course you ADS, but even then, it's still pretty hard to see. If you turn on your LOD quality all the way to Ultra though, which honestly doesn't really do much for your PC either, then at least when you ADS, things become a lot more clear. Whereas if you had ADS'd on the other setting, it wouldn't be as clear. Whereas if you were ADS'd on the last setting, it definitely wouldn't be as clear. One thing I also can say for some reason is that if you lean, it makes it a lot clearer as well, which wouldn't happen on the lower setting. So if you're still having issues even after turning the setting up, just walk around leaned everywhere if you're taking long angles, and it should pretty much just go away. Now, out of all of the settings in this video, the one I'm about to talk about is one of the most crucial ones ever. If you go to your options and you go to your accessibility tab, you need to turn your screen shake intensity off of default. Screen shake intensity is just the amount of times that your screen shakes randomly whenever explosions go off. For example, with my hand completely off of my mouse, this is how much my screen shakes when I throw an impact grenade at the wall. It shakes a lot. It's kind of crazy. But if I were to turn this completely off, hit apply, and try to impact a wall again with my mouse completely off, this is what it would look like. Your screen doesn't move at all, and not having a shaky screen makes it 10 times easier to kill somebody if you're surprising them with an explosive that gives you an angle onto any unsuspecting attackers or even defenders. Another setting that if you turned off could easily make you better is your gadget deployment being on standard. When your gadget deployment is on standard for somebody like Thermite, for example, that means that I'm not able to hold out my Thermite charge. It automatically puts it away because it doesn't detect a wall for it to be put on. The reason that's an issue is because when you immediately take out your breach charge next to a wall, it puts it on the wall without thinking, which is really bad. If they have a bandit or a Kate on the wall, and your Thatcher has an EMP that hasn't exploded yet, you immediately putting your Thermite on the breach will get it instantly killed the second it is deployed. So you want to be able to time exactly when you put your Thermite charge on the wall. So turning it off of standard and turning it on to advanced completely fixes this issue. Now I can click my ability button and just hover it outside the wall and wait for the Thatcher to get almost exploded and then put my Thermite on the wall at the perfect exact time that I want to give the bandit or the K that's tricking the wall even less time to react, which can be the difference between this wall opening or staying closed. The difference between the charge living or the charge dying. Now for the final setting of this video that you need to turn off is the automatic setting for drone after prep. Let's say for example that I know the bomb site is upstairs on Chalet and I drive my drone through the basement. Then I come up the stairs. If in the last 5 seconds I'm trying to run away from somebody and get out the door, when I'm right outside the door and the prep phase ends, I immediately get kicked off of my drone and the defender kills my drone. That's bad. We don't want that to happen. So instead, turn your drone after prep onto manual. This will make it to where if you're in those clutch situations where you're just about to reach the end before the prep phase ends, you won't get kicked off your drone. In fact, you can keep going, and then your drone won't die, and then you can get off of your drone whenever you please, even after the prep phase is ended. But with that out of the way, my name's Alka. Check out this next video, and I hope we'll see you there.